No, no buzz. A Just Bees book club. I read the longest piece of nonfiction I've read this year, which is wild and kind of personally disappointing. Not regarding this book, just in personal life. Today we're talking What a Mushroom Lives For, Matsutake and the Worlds They Make by Michael J. Hathaway. Hathaway is a professor of anthropology in Canada and a member of the Matsutake Worlds Research Group, which is why this came onto my radar, because it is in some sense, sort of explicitly stated, sort of the middle part of an academic trilogy of books about Matsutake mushrooms, as written by three different authors. So this is the second book in that sort of loose trilogy. I think it's explicitly referred to as an academic trilogy, which is fun. I had pulled the name of the third author. So there's still a forthcoming book by Shiho Satsuka, but the first book in this sort of trilogy is the Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Lowenhop Singh. A book I really, really, really loved reading. It's one of those ones that I kind of want to go back to at some point because I've forgotten so many of the details. But The Mushroom at the End of the World is a book that was written. It's sort of I think Lowenhop Singh is a professor of ethnography. So it's very much in that world, but it does a really good job, I think, in my memory at least, of sort of taking a look at Matsutake mushrooms, a mushroom which I was completely unfamiliar with prior to that book, but which is sort of well known as a mushroom that is sort of considered a gift mushroom in Japan. It is a particular kind of mushroom that is wrapped up in Japan's cultural history, that is sort of undomesticatable, and at least at this point, according to these two books I've read, there's a lot of research into the potentialities of either domesticating it or lab growing it, or growing it under very specific conditions that are sort of not panning out. The Mushroom at the End of the World, I think the thing that really got me with it is it did a really good job of talking very specifically about mushroom pickers, the folks who I guess what I'm saying is Lowenhop Singh does a good job of embedding with certain groups of people, and also sort of teasing out the sort of supply chain and issue and just questions of capital that are involved in the picking, the distribution, and the selling and gifting of these kinds of mushrooms, which Hathaway in this book I think does an interesting job of following up on that on certain levels. But this one is there's a scope. There's a scope to this book. There's a scope issue to this book, I think. I will say, just top level, had a good time reading this. I think there's a lot of stuff to chew on in What a Mushroom Lives For. There's just a lot, honestly. My big takeaway, I think, is that there are 2 or 3 really good books in this. And I mean that in the opposite way of how I would usually say that, which is, I'm not saying there's 2 or 3 good books in here, and if Hathaway had focused on any one of those books, it would have been a better thing. The thing I am saying that to mean right now is I think this book could be incredible, and I think it falls short of that, at least for me, at least for this reading, but I do tend to believe that is simply the case. There is a there's a book about specifically the sort of broad things that Hathaway is bringing to bear here that I think this book could have been uh, like God, like really, 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 really impactful. And I just think it doesn't cross that finish line, which is a bummer. It's a bummer when that happens. Um, that's not to say don't read this book. You did already, right? You're a B. It's to say that it just doesn't quite pull it off. So sort of at the high level, this is a book about about matsutake mushrooms, but specifically about like the history of fungi on Earth. It's very specifically a book about um, sort of a human centric worldview. About biology's sort of history, not sort of literally the history of biology and its influence by Europeans, very specifically, but like European philosophy also. There's long questions in this book of what would it look, or like what is the specificity of the development of biology in places like the UK that really don't like fungi, that like didn't understand that fungi were a thing for centuries beyond like a potential pathogen, versus other cultures that could have potentially sort of created the discipline. So there's a lot of like a lot of almost it's not pedagogy, but there's a lot of very specific disciplinary thinking that's happening in here, that is tied to both language and historical culture. Uh, there is a anthrocentric. Is that the word I'm looking for? Anyway, there's a lot of thinking of how closely related fungi are to humans based on our current biological understandings, and how those have come after again centuries of thinking about the world as being made by people and animals as being sort of this secondary tier of things that can react but not act in and of themselves, versus so we're talking flora there, and then this sort of ambient understanding that fauna simply exists and doesn't even really, like, if it responds to stimuli, it's like an interesting thing. It's not a given. I think that's all really good baseline history and problematizing of history to start with. Like, again, I think this book is. I think this book could. I think all of the sort of baseline assumptions here, maybe not all, but like the baseline assumptions in this book, in I almost said the mushroom at the end of the world, and what a mushroom lives for, are real fucking solid. And I'm gonna get into a little bit more going forward. I don't. This is the longest book of nonfiction I've read this year. I'm kind of out of practice, so take that as you will. But I think it gets a little scattershot, and I think there are probably potential paths for research and for clarification that Hathaway just doesn't quite get to, that I think would have made this book like really, 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 really impactful, rather than sort of a good time. I think the way I have phrased this to people when I've been talking about this book, sort of like working through it in the past, is like, this is a book that I think, written a little differently, could potentially like rewrite parts of my brain. Could be like the sort of thing that you come back to over and over again, because there is a sort of theoretical grounding that it is pointing towards, that it never quite gets to. What I came away from this book thinking is like, I know a bunch of facts about mushrooms, which is a different thing. It's not a bad thing. I love to know more facts about mushrooms. I love to have read a chapter that explains to me that certain mushrooms hunt. That's cool as hell. I love the first chapter of this book, which is like a sort of a speculative history of the planet that, this one, Earth, um, that takes fungi as a central driver of the way the planet functions. Right? There's a fucking claim in here that I've brought up every time I've talked about mushrooms recently, that like there is an argument to be made that like coal exists because of mushrooms, and it's a fun argument. It's really well told. Ultimately, it is a fact. Not a fact. It's not even that. It's a piece of trivia in my brain rather than a sort of fundamental restructuring of how I think about how the planet works. Which again, when I say a book can do that, I am heaping praise. It is backhanded because it doesn't do it. But like to even reach that point, I think is a really strong recommendation for me, I guess. And I'm always extremely aware, like maybe it's just my brain wasn't firing right. Maybe approaching this, from a different perspective would have led to a different feeling about this book. But ultimately, what I came down on is it's got a bunch of really cool facts about mushrooms, and it's very thoughtful, and it's deeply interested in people while also decentering people. I think that's fantastic. Ultimately, mushroom facts though. So yeah, the sort of big outline here. Let's take a look at the table of contents. We got a forward by Anna Lohan Singh. We got a little preface. And then we go through the chapters, right? We got the introduction, sort of sets up the things. It's an academic book in that way. We got chapter 1, Fungal Planet, the little-known story of how fungi helped foster terrestrial life. This is, this is talking about, deep time, the way that mycorrhizal networks have existed forever, and they are probably part of the reason why things like trees exist, because of the lack of bioavailability of specific minerals and nutrients for plants for a very long time meant that nothing bigger than like a grass could really exist, and those mycorrhizal networks unlocked certain minerals and nutrients in general that allowed for trees, that allowed for plants to get to the point where they could develop wood, an important thing in life, as we know it at least. And the sort of the coal argument is basically like that. There are like a millennia, maybe 2 gap between when plants had that bioavailable nutrient source and developed wood, and when, at least I guess as far as we know, fungi developed, I think it's lignin or lignin. I actually never heard this word out loud. Lignin. Sort of the I believe enzyme that allows for mushrooms to decompose wood or to eat wood. So there's just literally a millennia or more of time in which plants could be trees and nothing could decompose them, nothing could consume them in any way, which is it's really interesting. Chapter 2 is everyday fungal world making, and that sort of introduces, it's been introduced, but that sort of digs into the concept of world making, a thing I hadn't thought about in a very long time. I ages and ages ago took a couple classes with a professor who was very interested in specifically the term that he used was worlding, but sort of similar idea of thinking through how things make the world in not in their own image. That's just a stock phrase. how things make the world, right? Like how hmm, how the easy example of this, right, is people, right? People make the world. So we do things like use tools to build our environment. We do things like farm, period. Uh, we reshape the world, right? This goes, from putting a hammer in a wall, using a hammer to put a nail in a wall to um, producing so much producing so much carbon that the world boils, right? Scales. It crosses scales, right? Um, and so this second chapter, again, everyday fungal world making, sort of dives deep into how various kinds of mushrooms, including matsutake, but the first three, I think, chapters are not really specifically focused on matsutake. How certain mushrooms, or mushrooms in general, do things that reshape the world, that how they do things that push the world into a better one for them to live in sometimes, that or not, right? Like I said, scale is different, and I think it's a really interesting, thing, right? It's like it's taking mushrooms and thinking how are they agents in the world rather than some simple passive things that happen to exist to be exploited, right? um, Chapter 3 is Umwelt, the sensorial experience and interpretation of the lively world. um, in some ways probably the most interesting chapter to me. I said it that way because I couldn't decide whether to say interesting or intriguing, and so I said interesting. I didn't say interesting. I said interesting, something like that. Whatever. Um, this is a sort of a long argument that, in some ways, boils down to um, how does one see the world? How does one sensorily engage with the world? Why do we think of it in terms of human senses and not the broader understanding of sense, like sense knowledge or sensational questions that we now are at least semi aware of, in terms of like how I think one big example is like flies see a lot faster than we do, and the example there is, right, like a film shot at 24 frames per second to us looks like life. To a fly would look like a series of stills with a bunch of like long sequences of black screen between them. I'm trying to look specifically for the definition of Umwelt that is in here. Mhm. uh, oh, right, this is all about Jacob von Uexküll, uh, a 19th and early 20th century biologist, uh, who was trying to think about the world of animals specifically, and working from that to thinking of sort of the activity, the agentivity of mushrooms. Whole organism biology. It's fun. Yes. Ixkill's main contribution was the concept of the Umwelt, which literally means environment in German, but which he used to describe the world as it is sensorially experienced by particular organisms. So yeah, so Umwelt is like how something experiences through their senses. Um, famously, right? Like you walk a dog, the dog smells a lot of things. Dog love to smell, because, well, I don't know. I haven't done that work. Um, but like, I guess Umwelt is the idea of sort of taking in the environmental experience of specifically for Ixkill, like mountains. Not mountains. What? What? Where did mountains come from? Specifically, like from the experience of animals. I don't know where fucking mountains came from. That was wild. Okay. Um, and then yeah, Hathaway sort of like extends the sort of possible argument of like doing that, specifically for mushrooms. Um, Chapter 4 is Matsutake's journey. This is sort of a broad history of what we know of Matsutake, how where they sort of initially showed up, which is to say we don't know, and the ways that they have traveled across the continents to end up in like being primarily grown in places like um, with the Henan version of China, Japan for a very long time, uh, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest specifically, and maybe a little bit of Northern California, which is where a lot of the mushroom at the end of the world sort of embeds. And then there's like spots, I think like Finland or one of those, Northern European countries. Yeah, there's a map. It's in both of these books. It's kind of fun. But there's like a lot of talk about the question of, is this because of sporulation? Is this because, Matsutake happened to shoot up spores that landed in these different areas? Is it because of continental drift? Is it, X, Y, or Z? And then chapter 5 is the Yi in the Matsutake. This is one of the ones that like kind of bothered me, and I should have really just left a fucking bookmark in here. But this is sort of closer to the, the anthropology ethnography sort of field, because Hathaway spends a bunch of time in the Henan area of China, and specifically with certain this sort of ethnic group called the Yi that I'm going to do it from memory because I'm not going to find this right now. This is a lot longer than I was expecting to talk about that. I still don't know where fucking mountains came from. That was just not a word that I was thinking about. Anyway, there's a sort of bit of field work happens here. Hathaway sort of spends time over the course of like a decade and a half or 2 decades or something like that, sort of regularly visiting, sort of embedding with folks, having long conversations, not just about cultural history, but about the ways in which mushroom hunting is impacted by different political regimens, different entrepreneurs, let's say. But there's a bit sort of early in this chapter where Hathaway like talks about how the Yi are like they're sort of an imposed ethnic minority, in that they are a group of a bunch of different ethnic minorities that like were referred to as Yi because I don't remember what the translation was, but it was like pretty fucking derogatory. And he like specifically mentions that they have that these people speak multiple different languages, many of them, or enough of them at least, like unintelligible, so like languages. And then he just starts just referring to the Yi culture and people speaking Yi, and I don't know, maybe there's sort of an elision happening there of like that though those differences have sort of creolized or something like that, but like it brings up this thing that is like, hey, here is the history of these people, the oppression that they underwent. And anyway, they're all speaking the language that they all share, even though I just said like 2 pages ago that they don't necessarily all share a language. I don't know. That bit was a bit weird. And then I guess, is it the final chapter or is it in this chapter as well? Yeah. So there's that sort of field work element, and then the chapter 6 is Tibetan entanglements with plants, animals, and fungi, because Tibet is another place where matsutake grow wild, and there's a sort of culture of pickers, and sort of the distinction between those two is Hathaway talks a lot about how a lot of the wealth generated by the yi gets sort of funneled back into the development of like cultural spaces, of festivals, of sort of ways that and literally like institutional buildings, and then he goes over to Tibet and talks about how a lot of the Tibetan wealth that is generated from matsutake picking is actively displacing sort of historical cultures, especially like the engagement of these folks with yak as their primary sort of like living and who they live with, and instead of there being large sort of cultural projects happening or histories, it is turned into like a lot of individual houses, like people buy houses off of matsutake mushroom or matsutake. Yeah, I mean that's true. People buy houses off of matsutake money rather than reinvesting it into the community. Is sort of the extremely high level version of that chapter. He does a much more thorough job of talking about like both individuals and sort of structural considerations, and community stuff in both of these things that I am sort of giving the gloss. And then there's the last chapter, final thoughts on understanding fungi and others as world makers, where he sort of goes over his stuff and sort of talks through like what did we learn. I think the chapter is pretty solid. Again, the reason I'm talking about the book this way is because I think there is a book in here, and I don't know that it's going to get written, but like there's a book in here that has a bit of a stronger theoretical grounding that I think goes so hard. And the book I read goes pretty hard. Like I really do care about all the things that I just talked about, but like they do feel like a collection of things. And then there's so that gets us from page I to page 204. The book then goes to page 270. So the last nearly 70 pages are appendices, notes, bibliography, acknowledgments, and an index. All those things, very cool. Really love a well-cited book. That's great. They love a good meaty bibliography. I don't work in this field. I never will. I've read like 3-4 books about mushrooms. I think they're real cool. I mostly care about mushrooms in terms of fiction. Never gonna engage with that bibliography in any real studied way. I don't know. Maybe never is a bit too big of a thing to say, but I'm glad to have them because it makes me feel like this is a serious work in some ways. And that's sort of a silly thing to say, right? That's a silly thing to say if you don't follow it up, because then what you're saying is like, would you perform academia for me, please? But I would rather it be there than not, 100% of the time. So, glad to see it. From what I glanced at, the appendices were really interesting, but not like mind-blowing. Yeah. I don't know, mushrooms are cool. This book has got a lot of facts about mushrooms, which is a cool thing. That's a cool thing. It's simply a cool thing. Thanks for not watching.